The morning sun broke through the clouds over London, casting golden rays across Buckingham Palace. Inside the historic residence, Catherine was already awake, her heart racing with anticipation. Today was not just any day. It was the day the entire world would watch as King Charles III received his crown. She glanced at the clock on the ornate wall. They had exactly 2 hours before the procession would begin. William stirred beside her, sensing her movement. He reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. They had been preparing for this moment for months, but nothing could quite capture the mixture of excitement and nerves that filled the air. This was history unfolding, and their children would be part of it. The thought made Catherine smile despite the butterflies in her stomach. Down the hallway, Prince George was already dressed in his formal attire, standing before a tall mirror. At 9 years old, he understood the significance of the day better than his younger siblings. He adjusted his collar for the third time, remembering everything his father had told him about proper posture and royal duties. George had always been a thoughtful child, but today he seemed years older, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that made his parents proud. Princess Charlotte came bursting into her brother's room, her dress swishing around her ankles. She twirled once, then twice, watching the fabric float through the air. Charlotte had been talking about this day for weeks, asking endless questions about crowns and carriages and whether she would get to wave at the crowds. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and even serious, George couldn't help but grin at his sister's excitement. Little Prince Louis was having a different morning altogether. At 5 years old, the formality of the occasion was somewhat lost on him. His nanny was patiently trying to keep him still long enough to fasten his shoes, but Louis kept squirming away, more interested in the toy soldier he had smuggled into his pocket. He didn't quite understand why everyone was making such a fuss about Grandpa getting a fancy hat, but he liked the idea of riding in a special car. Catherine made her way to the children's wing, her heels clicking softly on the polished floors. She found Charlotte practicing her curtsy in front of a patient maid, dipping down again and again until she got it just right. When Charlotte saw her mother, she rushed over, wrapping her arms around Catherine's waist. The princess asked if her hair looked pretty enough for the cameras, and Catherine knelt down, tucking a stray curl behind her daughter's ear, assuring her she looked absolutely beautiful. William joined them moments later, looking distinguished in his ceremonial uniform. The gold braiding caught the light, and the medals on his chest represented generations of royal service. He looked every bit the future king, though his eyes still held that warmth and humor that had made people love him from the start. He high-fived George, complimented Charlotte's dress, and scooped Louis into his arms, tickling him until the boy giggled uncontrollably. The family gathered in the main drawing room for a final check before heading to Westminster Abbey. A small army of staff members fussed over last-minute details, straightening ties and smoothing out wrinkles that nobody else could see. Catherine's dress was a masterpiece of elegant design, paying tribute to British craftsmanship while maintaining her signature grace. She wore it with the kind of natural poise that had made her a fashion icon worldwide. Charles and Camilla arrived to collect the family, and the king looked both regal and slightly nervous. He embraced each of his grandchildren, whispering something that made George stand a little straighter and Charlotte beam with pride. Even Louis seemed to sense that today was special, settling down in his grandfather's presence. The family exchanged glances, unspoken messages of support and love passing between them. The convoy of vehicles was ready, gleaming in the morning light. Crowds had been gathering since dawn, lining the streets with flags and banners. The noise from outside was already growing, a distant roar of excitement that would only build as the day progressed. Catherine took a deep breath, squeezed William's hand one more time, and then they were moving, stepping out into the daylight as cameras flashed from every direction. The children handled the initial attention remarkably well. George walked with measured steps, remembering to smile at the appropriate moments. Charlotte waved enthusiastically, delighted by the sea of faces calling their names. Louis looked around with wide eyes, momentarily stunned by the sheer number of people. William kept a gentle hand on his youngest son's shoulder, guiding him forward with quiet reassurance. As they settled into the royal car, Catherine helped buckle the children in, making sure everyone was comfortable for the ride to Westminster Abbey. The streets were packed more densely than any of them had ever seen. People had traveled from all corners of the country and beyond, camping overnight just to catch a glimpse of the historic procession. Signs of congratulations and support filled every available space, and the atmosphere was electric with celebration. Charlotte pressed her face against the window, marveling at the decorations that transformed London into a festival of red, white, and blue. She pointed out everything she saw to Louis, who was finally starting to grasp that this was indeed something special. George sat quietly, taking it all in with thoughtful observation. He knew that one day this would be his own coronation, and while that day was far in the future, he was learning what it meant to serve. William and Catherine exchanged glances over the children's heads. They had worked hard to give their family as normal a childhood as possible, but moments like these reminded them of the unique path their children would walk. Yet seeing them now excited and confident filled them with hope. These were not just royal children being paraded for cameras. These were their babies, growing into remarkable young people who would shape the monarchy's future. The towers of Westminster Abbey came into view, and the energy in the car shifted. This was it. The moment they had been preparing for was finally here. Catherine smoothed down her dress one final time and gave each child a reassuring smile. William straightened his uniform and nodded to his wife. They were ready. As the car slowed to a stop and the door opened, the roar of the crowd washed over them like a wave, and the Cambridge family stepped forward into history. Westminster Abbey stood before them like a magnificent sentinel of history, its ancient stones having witnessed countless coronations over the centuries. Today it would witness another chapter in the long story of the British monarchy. The massive doors were open, revealing a glimpse of the grandeur inside. Dignitaries from around the world were already seated, their fine clothes creating a tapestry of colors within the sacred space. Catherine stepped out first, and immediately the crowd's cheers intensified. She had become beloved not through royal blood but through genuine connection with people. Her smile was warm and authentic as she turned to help Charlotte out of the car. The young princess emerged with careful grace, remembering all the lessons she had practiced. Behind them, William guided George and kept Louis close, making sure his energetic youngest stayed focused. The walk from the car to the Abbey entrance was short, but felt eternal under the weight of millions of watching eyes. Photographers jostled for position, their cameras creating a constant flutter of clicks and flashes. Charlotte's hand found her mother's, and Catherine gave it a gentle squeeze. The princess looked up at her mother, seeking reassurance, and found it in Catherine's calm expression. They moved forward together as a family unit, each supporting the other. Inside the Abbey, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The noise from outside became muffled, replaced by the hushed whispers of assembled guests and the occasional echo of footsteps on stone floors. The space was breathtaking. Flower arrangements of white roses and lilies lined the aisle, their fragrance subtle but present. Hundreds of candles flickered in sconces, casting dancing shadows on walls that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. George's eyes widened as he took in the scene. He had been in the Abbey before, but never like this. Every pew was filled with kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers, celebrities and religious leaders. The weight of ceremony pressed down on his young shoulders, but he stood tall. His father had told him that being royal meant serving others with dignity, and George was determined to make his family proud. Louis, however, was getting restless. The solemnity of the space meant nothing to a 5-year-old who had been sitting still for too long. He tugged at his father's hand, whispering questions about when the exciting part would start and whether there would be cake afterward. William suppressed a smile and whispered back that he needed to be patient just a little longer. Catherine caught the exchange and felt a swell of love for her little family navigating this extraordinary moment. They were shown to their seats in the front section, positions of honor reserved for the immediate royal family. Princess Anne gave them an encouraging nod. Prince Edward and Sophie smiled warmly at the children. The family was together, supporting Charles as he prepared to take on the crown. It was a moment that bound them all, connecting past generations to those yet to come. The ceremony began with a procession of clergy members, their robes flowing as they moved with measured steps. The choir's voices rose in harmony, filling every corner of the Abbey with sacred music. Charlotte sat forward, entranced by the beauty of it all. She loved music and often sang around the palace, but this was something else entirely. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, powerful and moving. Then came Charles and Camilla walking side by side down the aisle. The king looked composed, though those who knew him well could see the emotion in his eyes. He had waited his entire life for this moment, and now it was here. Camilla walked with quiet dignity, her own journey to this day having been complex and sometimes painful. But here they were together, about to be crowned before God and country. William felt a lump form in his throat watching his father. Their relationship had weathered storms and emerged stronger. He thought of his mother, Diana, and wondered what she would have made of this day. He liked to think she would be proud, that she would see how the family had grown and changed. Beside him, Catherine seemed to read his thoughts and took his hand, anchoring him in the present. The Archbishop of Canterbury began the ancient rituals, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. Each word was weighted with tradition, phrases that had been spoken at coronations for centuries. George listened carefully, understanding that he was witnessing something that connected him to every monarch who had come before. The crown jewels were brought forward, glittering under the abbey's lights, each piece representing different aspects of sovereignty. Louis started to fidget more noticeably. His legs swung back and forth, and he slumped in his seat. Catherine gently straightened him up, whispering that it wouldn't be much longer. But Louis was reaching his limit. He yawned widely, not bothering to cover his mouth, and several people nearby noticed. Some smiled sympathetically, remembering their own children at that age. Others raised eyebrows, expecting perfect behavior regardless of age. The moment arrived when the Archbishop lifted St. Edward's crown high above Charles's head. The abbey fell into complete silence. Even Louis stopped moving, sensing something important was happening. The crown descended slowly, settling onto the king's head, and in that instant Charles became the crowned monarch. The congregation erupted in the traditional cry of recognition, voices joining together in affirmation of their new king. Trumpets blared, their bright notes cutting through the abbey's reverence. Charlotte clapped her hands together in delight at the sudden burst of sound and celebration. George allowed himself a small smile, proud of his grandfather and aware of the continuity he represented. William's chest swelled with emotion, seeing his father finally receive the recognition he had spent decades preparing for. Camilla was crowned as queen shortly after, her ceremony simpler but no less significant. She wore a modified version of Queen Mary's crown, the diamonds catching every ray of light. When the crown touched her head, she closed her eyes briefly, perhaps offering a private prayer or simply taking in the magnitude of the moment. Then she opened them and faced forward, ready to embrace her new role. The blessing that followed was deeply moving. The Archbishop's words spoke of service, duty, and love for the nation and its people. He reminded everyone present that with great privilege came great responsibility. Charles and Camilla knelt before the altar, heads bowed in humility, while prayers were offered for their reign and for the country they would serve. As the ceremony moved toward its conclusion, the choir performed a specially commissioned piece of music. The composition was modern yet respectful of tradition, much like the monarchy itself was trying to be. Catherine found herself moved to tears, and she wasn't alone. Throughout the abbey, people dabbed at their eyes, overwhelmed by the beauty and significance of what they were witnessing. Finally, it was time for the newly crowned king and queen to process back down the aisle. Charles and Camilla walked with renewed purpose, the weight of their crowns both literal and metaphorical. As they passed the Cambridge family, Charles met William's eyes, and father and son shared a moment of understanding that needed no words. Then they were past, heading toward the abbey doors and the waiting crowds beyond. The world outside Westminster Abbey had reached a fever pitch of excitement. The ceremony had been broadcast on massive screens set up throughout London, and millions had watched every moment. Now, as word spread that the newly crowned king and queen were about to emerge, the noise level surged to almost deafening proportions. People waved flags frantically, calling out congratulations and cheers of support. William and Catherine gathered their children, preparing to follow in the grand procession. This would be the moment when the world truly saw them as a family unit, supporting the new king and representing the future of the monarchy. Catherine checked each child one more time, making sure their clothes were still pristine after sitting through the long ceremony. Charlotte's dress had a small wrinkle, which Catherine smoothed out with practiced efficiency. George took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. He had been told that the procession would be viewed by billions of people worldwide, and the thought was almost too big to comprehend. But he remembered his father's words about duty and service. This wasn't about him or his nerves. This was about supporting his grandfather and showing the world that the royal family stood united. Louis, meanwhile, had perked up considerably. The prospect of riding in a grand carriage through cheering crowds was much more appealing than sitting still in a church. He bounced on his toes, asking his mother if he could wave to everyone. Catherine smiled and told him that waving would be perfectly appropriate, but he needed to remember his best manners. Louis nodded solemnly, though his eyes sparkled with barely contained energy. They emerged from the abbey to an explosion of sound. The crowd's roar was physical, a wall of noise that washed over them. Charlotte's eyes went wide with wonder and just a touch of overwhelm. There were so many people, stretching as far as she could see in every direction, faces upon faces, all looking at them, all celebrating. She gripped her mother's hand tighter, but maintained her composure, offering a small wave that sent nearby spectators into fresh cheers. The Gold State coach awaited Charles and Camilla, a magnificent vehicle that looked like something from a fairy tale. Its golden surface gleamed in the sunlight, and the intricate carvings depicted scenes from British history. 8 Windsor gray horses stood ready to pull it, their coats brushed to perfection, their bearing proud and calm despite the chaos around them. This coach had carried monarchs to Coronation since 1762, and today it carried another. William's family would travel in a different carriage, one slightly less ornate but still magnificent. As they climbed inside, Louis pressed his face against the window immediately, waving at anyone who made eye contact. Charlotte sat more primly, but her smile was genuine and warm. George positioned himself where he could see out but maintain proper posture, already thinking about how a future king should present himself. The procession began to move, and London erupted. Every street they passed was lined with people celebrating. Some had painted their faces with the Union Jack. Others wore elaborate costumes or held signs declaring their love for the royal family. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, waving flags that were almost as big as they were. The energy was infectious, turning even the most reserved spectators into enthusiastic participants. Catherine waved steadily, her smile never faltering even though her arm was beginning to ache. She had learned long ago how to maintain grace under scrutiny, how to look engaged and happy even during marathon public appearances. But today the happiness wasn't forced. Looking at the joy on people's faces, seeing how the coronation had brought the nation together in celebration, she felt genuinely moved. William divided his attention between acknowledging the crowds and keeping an eye on his children. Louis was doing wonderfully, waving with both hands at times, his face alight with glee. Charlotte alternated between waving and pointing out interesting sights to her younger brother. George took his responsibilities seriously, offering measured waves and maintaining the dignified bearing that had been instilled in him. The route took them past some of London's most iconic landmarks. They passed the Houses of Parliament, where politicians of all parties had gathered on the steps to watch the procession. Big Ben rose behind them, its clock face marking this historic moment in time. Further along, they could see the London Eye in the distance, where brave souls had secured spots in the observation capsules for an aerial view of the celebrations. Street performers had positioned themselves along the route, adding to the festive atmosphere. Musicians played instruments, their melodies almost lost in the general noise but adding to the texture of the day. Artists had created elaborate chalk drawings on sidewalks depicting crowns and the royal family. Food vendors did brisk business, selling everything from traditional fish and chips to modern fusion cuisine, all branded with coronation themes. As they progressed through central London, Catherine noticed the incredible diversity of the crowds. People from every walk of life had come together for this moment. She saw elderly couples who had attended the last coronation as young people, their faces wrinkled but eyes bright with memory and new experience. Young families held up babies, wanting them to be present for history, even if they wouldn't remember it. Teenagers filmed everything on their phones, documenting every second for social media. Louis's energy never flagged. If anything, he grew more animated as the procession continued. At one point, he caught sight of a small dog wearing a tiny crown and became so excited that he nearly climbed over Charlotte to get a better look. William gently pulled him back, reminding him to stay seated, but he was grinning as he did so. There was something delightful about Louis's unfiltered enthusiasm. Charlotte began to ask questions as they rode. She wanted to know why some buildings had more flags than others, whether everyone in the whole world was watching, and if they could do this again next week. Catherine answered each question patiently, using them as teaching moments about history, tradition, and what it meant to be part of the royal family. Charlotte absorbed it all with the quick intelligence that made her teachers rave about her potential. The procession paused briefly at one point. A planned stop that allowed the crowds in that section to get an extended view. A group of schoolchildren, all wearing matching shirts printed with the Union Jack, began singing the national anthem. Their young voices carried clearly, and soon others joined in. Within moments, thousands of people were singing together, the anthem rising above the London streets in a powerful display of unity and patriotism. George felt tears prick his eyes but blinked them back. He was moved by the singing, by the sight of so many people coming together. This was what his father meant by service. These people weren't celebrating a person. They were celebrating an idea, a continuity, a shared national identity, and his family was the symbol of that identity, a responsibility both humbling and awesome. When the procession began moving again, they entered areas that had been decorated even more elaborately. Some streets had arches of flowers spanning overhead, creating tunnels of blooms that filled the air with perfume. Others had projection screens showing highlights from the ceremony, allowing people who had missed the live broadcast to catch up. The organization was impressive, the result of months of planning by countless individuals. William reflected on how different this coronation was from those of the past. Modern technology meant that billions could watch simultaneously across the globe. Social media allowed instant sharing of photos and reactions. Yet the core of the ceremony remained unchanged. Ancient rituals performed with the same reverence as they had been for centuries. It was a perfect metaphor for the monarchy itself, adapting while maintaining its essential character. As they approached Buckingham Palace, the crowds grew even denser if that was possible. Everyone wanted to be near the palace for the balcony appearance, the traditional finale to Coronation Day. The palace gates came into view, their gold paint glinting in the afternoon sun. The palace itself stood solid and imposing, draped with enormous versions of the royal standard and the national flag. The carriages passed through the gates, and suddenly the noise level dropped. They were in the palace courtyard, surrounded by high walls that muffled the crowd's roar to a distant murmur. It felt like stepping into a different world, a brief respite from the intensity of the public spectacle. Louis immediately slumped in his seat, the adrenaline that had sustained him finally beginning to fade. The palace staff were ready the moment the carriages stopped. Doors were opened with practiced precision, and steps were positioned to help everyone disembark safely. Catherine stepped down first, immediately turning to lift Louis out. The little prince was fading fast, his earlier energy depleted by the long day. She set him on his feet and steadied him, noting the tired droop to his shoulders. Charlotte emerged next, still bright-eyed despite the marathon of ceremony and procession. She looked around the courtyard with interest, having only been here a few times before. The palace was vast, its windows seeming to stretch endlessly upward. Pigeons roosted in the eaves, cooing softly, seemingly unbothered by the historic events unfolding below them. George came out with William, and together they looked every bit the future of the monarchy. The resemblance between father and son was striking, not just in their physical features but in the way they carried themselves. William placed a hand on George's shoulder, a gesture of support and pride. They had gotten through the public portion successfully, but the day wasn't over yet. Inside the palace, it was surprisingly cool after the warmth of the crowds and the enclosed carriage. The high ceilings and marble floors created an almost cathedral-like atmosphere. Charles and Camilla had already gone ahead, needing a few moments to collect themselves before the balcony appearance. It was one thing to be crowned in the relative privacy of Westminster Abbey, quite another to face the masses gathered outside the palace. A butler directed the Cambridge family to a private sitting room where they could wait. The room was elegantly furnished with antique pieces that had been in the royal collection for generations. Portraits of previous monarchs looked down from the walls, their faces stern and formal in the style of their times. Charlotte studied them with curiosity, wondering if anyone had ever smiled in old paintings. Louis immediately collapsed onto a sofa, his formal clothes suddenly seeming too tight and uncomfortable. Catherine sat beside him, loosening his collar slightly to help him breathe easier. He rested his head against her shoulder, his eyes half closed. The poor child had been a trooper, but he was only 5, and the day had been extraordinarily long and stimulating. A staff member brought in refreshments, including juice boxes for the children and tea for the adults. William gratefully accepted a cup, realizing he hadn't had anything to drink since early morning. George sipped his juice carefully, mindful not to spill anything on his formal wear. Charlotte gulped hers down quickly, then asked for another, making her parents laugh softly. They could hear the crowd outside even through the thick palace walls. The noise was constant, a low rumble punctuated by occasional surges of cheering. People were chanting for the king to appear, wanting to see him in his crown one more time. The balcony appearance was a tradition that stretched back generations, a chance for the monarch to acknowledge the people's support and celebration. An aide appeared at the door, informing them that it was nearly time. Catherine began tidying the children up again, checking that everyone looked presentable. She redid Charlotte's hair, which had gotten slightly mussed during the carriage ride. George stood still while his father adjusted his jacket. Louis whimpered slightly, not wanting to go back out into the noise and chaos, but Catherine soothed him with gentle words and the promise that this would be the last public appearance of the day. They made their way through the palace corridors, following the aide to the room that opened onto the famous balcony. Charles and Camilla were already there, the king still wearing his crown, which caught the light streaming through the tall windows. He looked tired but exhilarated, riding the high of the day's events. When he saw his grandchildren, his face softened into a warm smile. Charles knelt down to Louis's level, asking the boy how he was holding up. Louis, revived slightly by the juice and the brief rest, managed to smile and told his grandfather that he had waved to lots and lots of people. Charles laughed and said that he had seen Louis waving and that he had done wonderfully. The exchange was sweet and genuine, a reminder that beneath all the ceremony and tradition, they were still just a family. The moment arrived. The balcony doors were opened and the sound that had been muffled became a roar. The crowd stretched across the palace grounds and down the mall, a sea of people that seemed to have no end. Red, white, and blue dominated the scene, flags waving in constant motion. When the crowd saw the doors opening, the volume increased impossibly, reaching levels that made the balcony itself seem to vibrate. Charles stepped out first, Camilla at his side. The reaction was overwhelming. People screamed themselves hoarse, jumped up and down, waved frantically. This was their king, crowned and acknowledged, ready to lead them into a new era. Charles raised his hand in a wave, and the crowd responded with fresh enthusiasm. Camilla's smile was wide and genuine, touched by the warmth of the reception. Then William and Catherine emerged with their children, and if possible, the crowd's reaction intensified even further. The Cambridge family had become beloved figures in their own right, representing both tradition and modernity. Catherine's fashion choices influenced trends worldwide. William's dedication to charitable causes earned respect, and the children captured hearts simply by being themselves. George stepped forward carefully, very aware that millions of eyes were on him. He waved with measured precision, remembering everything he had been taught about public appearances. His wave was princely, dignified, exactly what people expected from a future king. Yet there was also a glimpse of the boy beneath the formality, a slight nervousness in his eyes that made him relatable. Charlotte had no such reservations. She waved enthusiastically, her whole arm moving in big, sweeping motions. She pointed at things in the crowd that caught her eye, leaned over the balcony railing to get a better look, and generally radiated pure joy. The cameras loved her for it, capturing her infectious enthusiasm from every angle. She was the perfect blend of royal grace and childhood innocence. Louis, held securely by William, seemed overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crowd. For a moment, he buried his face in his father's shoulder, hiding from the intensity of attention. But William whispered something in his ear, and slowly Louis turned back around. His little hand came up in a tentative wave, and when he saw people waving back specifically at him, his face broke into a delighted grin. The family stood together on that balcony, a living representation of the monarchy's continuity. 4 generations were present if you counted Charles, and each represented different aspects of royal life. Charles embodied tradition and duty, having waited decades for this role. William and Catherine represented the modern face of royalty, balancing public service with attempts at normal family life. The children were the future, carrying the institution forward into an uncertain world. The moment everyone was waiting for finally arrived. The Royal Air Force flew overhead in a spectacular display, jets leaving trails of red, white, and blue smoke across the London sky. The roar of the engines mixed with the crowd's cheers, creating a soundscape of celebration. Charlotte pointed excitedly at the planes, tugging on her mother's dress to make sure she saw them. Louis's eyes went wide with wonder, all thoughts of tiredness forgotten in the face of such spectacle. As the planes disappeared into the distance, their smoke trails slowly dissipating, Charles turned to his family. He said something that the crowd couldn't hear, but whatever it was made William smile and Catherine laugh softly. Then the king reached out and pulled them all closer together, an intimate family moment happening in the most public of settings. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. This was a family that had weathered scandals and tragedies, criticism and intense scrutiny. They had lost Diana too young, endured the complexities of modern royal life, and adapted to changing public expectations. Yet here they stood, united on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, celebrating a new beginning while honoring centuries of tradition. Catherine looked at her children and felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in how well they had handled themselves today, concern for the unique pressures they would face growing up in the spotlight, hope that she and William were preparing them properly for their future roles, and underneath it all, simple maternal love for three remarkable children who just happened to be royal. After what felt like an eternity on the balcony, the royal family finally retreated back into the palace. The moment the doors closed behind them, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the group. Louis immediately asked if he could take off his fancy shoes, which were pinching his feet. Catherine laughed and told him he could, watching as he kicked them off with obvious relief and wiggled his toes on the cool marble floor. The palace felt different now, less formal somehow. Staff members were relaxing slightly, their rigid professionalism giving way to genuine smiles and quiet celebrations of their own. Everyone had worked tirelessly to ensure the coronation went smoothly, and now they could allow themselves to feel proud of what had been accomplished. A maid passing by couldn't help but stop and tell Charlotte how lovely she had looked, making the princess blush with pleasure. Charles removed his crown carefully, handing it to an attendant who would return it to the Tower of London, where the crown jewels were kept. Without it, he looked more like himself, though there was a new quality to his bearing now, a weight of responsibility that came with the title he had officially assumed. He stretched his neck, working out the stiffness that came from hours of wearing the heavy ceremonial headpiece. The family moved to a larger reception room where a private celebration had been arranged. Close family members who hadn't been on the balcony were already there, along with a small number of trusted friends and advisors. The atmosphere was warm and convivial, a stark contrast to the formal ceremony of earlier. Someone had thoughtfully arranged for casual clothes to be available, and one by one, the family members slipped away to change into more comfortable attire. When Catherine emerged in a simple but elegant dress, she felt like herself again. The formal coronation gown had been beautiful but restricting, and she relished the freedom of movement. Louis had been changed into soft pajamas given his exhaustion and young age. He immediately curled up on a sofa with a blanket, clutching a stuffed toy that someone had brought from his room. Charlotte and George were allowed to stay up a bit longer, though they too had changed into comfortable clothes. Charlotte was telling anyone who would listen about everything she had seen, her words tumbling over each other in excitement. She described the flowers in Westminster Abbey, the gold on the carriage, the way the planes had painted the sky. Her enthusiasm made everyone smile, reminded of the wonder they themselves had felt before such things became routine. George was quieter, sitting with a plate of food and processing everything he had experienced. William sat down beside his eldest son, draping an arm around his shoulders. He asked George what he thought of the day, and the boy took his time answering. Finally, George said that it had been incredible but also a bit scary, knowing so many people were watching. William nodded, understanding completely, and told him that feeling was normal and actually showed good sense. The food was a mix of traditional British fare and modern cuisine, finger foods that could be eaten while mingling. There were tiny shepherd's pies, delicate smoked salmon blinis, miniature Yorkshire puddings with beef, and an array of sweets that drew the children like magnets. Charlotte tried a bit of everything, while George was more selective, sticking to familiar favorites. As the evening progressed, various family members approached William and Catherine to offer congratulations and share their observations of the day. Princess Anne remarked on how well the children had behaved, particularly noting Louis's eventual composure despite his young age. Prince Edward shared a funny moment he had witnessed in the crowd, a man so excited he had literally jumped out of his shoes. The stories and laughter helped everyone decompress from the intensity of the public ceremony. Charles made his way over to where his son and daughter-in-law stood, drinks in hand. He looked more relaxed now, the immediate pressure of the coronation behind him. He thanked them for their support, for how beautifully the children had represented the family. William assured him it had been an honor, that they were all proud to stand beside him on such an important day. The conversation was warm, but also tinged with the understanding that their relationship had shifted slightly with Charles's new role. Camilla joined them, having kicked off her own uncomfortable shoes and looking relieved to be in flats. She laughed about a moment during the ceremony when she had worried her crown might slip, though from the outside she had looked perfectly composed. Catherine could relate, sharing her own anxiety about Charlotte's energetic personality potentially leading to an unplanned moment. Thankfully, all the children had exceeded expectations. As the night wore on, Louis fell completely asleep on the sofa, his mouth slightly open, one hand still clutching his stuffed animal. Catherine looked at him tenderly, this little boy who had been thrust into such an extraordinary day. In sleep, he looked even younger, vulnerable and sweet. She made a mental note to thank him properly tomorrow for being so brave, even when things had clearly been overwhelming. Charlotte was starting to fade as well, her earlier energy finally depleting. She climbed into her mother's lap, resting her head against Catherine's chest. She murmured something about wanting to do it all again, about how pretty everything had been. Catherine stroked her hair, humming softly, and within minutes Charlotte had joined her brother in sleep. George remained awake, though he was clearly tired. He sat with his father, watching the adults talk and laugh, absorbing the atmosphere. At one point, Charles called George over and showed him something on his phone, images from the day that were already circulating on social media. The two looked at them together, the new king and the future king spanning generations and representing continuity. The celebration began to wind down as midnight approached. It had been an extraordinarily long day for everyone, starting before dawn and filled with intense moments of ceremony, public appearances, and emotional significance. Staff began quietly clearing away plates and glasses, working efficiently to restore order while the family said their goodbyes. William carried Louis, the boy not even stirring as he was lifted. Catherine gathered Charlotte, who mumbled sleepily but didn't fully wake. George walked on his own, though he leaned heavily against his father's side. They made their way through the palace corridors to their private apartments, their footsteps echoing softly in the quiet halls. Once there, Catherine and William tag-teamed getting the children properly into bed. Louis was placed gently in his bed, still fully asleep, his stuffed animal tucked in beside him. Charlotte woke just enough to brush her teeth and change into proper pajamas before collapsing back into bed. George managed his evening routine largely on his own, though his movements were slow with exhaustion. When all three children were settled, Catherine and William stood in the hallway between their rooms just looking at each other. They had done it. They had gotten through one of the most significant days in recent royal history, and their children had been absolute stars. No major mishaps, no meltdowns, just three kids being remarkably brave and poised under extraordinary circumstances. They retreated to their own room, equally exhausted but too keyed up to sleep immediately. They sat together on their bed, shoes off, formal clothes finally abandoned for comfortable loungewear. William turned on the television where news coverage of the coronation was still playing. They watched clips of themselves, seeing moments they had missed while living through them. There was Charlotte's enthusiastic waving that had captured hearts worldwide. George's dignified composure that showed wisdom beyond his years. Louis's brief moment of hiding before bravely turning back to wave. And countless shots of William and Catherine themselves, supporting each other and their children through every moment. Catherine commented on how strange it was to watch themselves like this, To see their lives played out on screen for the world to analyze and discuss. William agreed, noting that they looked more relaxed than he had felt. The cameras had been kind, capturing genuine moments of family connection rather than just formal poses. They talked about the children, about how proud they were. George's maturity had been impressive, his understanding of his role developing rapidly. Charlotte's joy had been infectious, reminding everyone that even royal events should have elements of fun and celebration. And Louis, despite being so young, had shown remarkable courage in facing such overwhelming attention. As they talked, both began to truly relax, the adrenaline of the day finally fading. They reflected on the ceremony itself, the beauty and tradition, the weight of history present in every moment. They discussed Charles and how different he had seemed with the crown on his head, not diminished by its weight but somehow more himself, stepping into a role he had been preparing for his entire life. Morning came far too early. Sunlight streamed through the windows of their apartments at Buckingham Palace, and Catherine woke to the sound of birds chirping outside. For a moment she forgot where she was and why she felt so exhausted. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back and she smiled despite her tiredness. They had done it. The coronation was over and it had been magnificent. William was still asleep beside her, looking peaceful in a way he rarely did during waking hours. The weight of responsibility he carried showed in the lines around his eyes, but in sleep, those worries smoothed away. Catherine watched him for a moment, thinking about the man she had married and the life they had built together. It was far from normal, but it was theirs, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway announced that at least one child was awake. Catherine slipped out of bed and opened the door to find Charlotte standing there in her nightgown, hair messy from sleep, clutching a doll. The princess asked if they could watch the coronation on television again, wanting to see all the parts she had missed while they were happening. Catherine laughed softly and agreed, leading Charlotte to the sitting room where she turned on the news. Sure enough, coverage of the coronation was still dominating every channel. They curled up together on the sofa, Catherine wrapping a blanket around them both as they watched highlights from the previous day. Charlotte provided running commentary, explaining to her mother where she had been during each moment and what she had been thinking. George appeared next, looking more rested than he had the night before. He joined them on the sofa, and together the three of them watched the ceremony unfold on screen. George was fascinated by the parts he hadn't been able to see, particularly the precise choreography of the ceremony and the historical significance of each element. He asked intelligent questions that showed he was really thinking about what it all meant. Louis was the last to wake, emerging with his hair sticking up in all directions and his stuffed animal dragging behind him. He climbed into his mother's lap without a word, still half asleep. They sat like that for a while, the four of them peaceful and together, watching history they had just been part of. William eventually joined them, having been woken by the sound of the television and his family's voices. He brought juice and pastries that someone from the kitchen had sent up, knowing the family would need breakfast. They ate informally, getting crumbs on the sofa and not worrying about formality. This was their time, their private moment before the world intruded again. The morning papers had been delivered and William flipped through them, showing Catherine the headlines. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, praising the ceremony's beauty, the king's dignity, and particularly the Cambridge children's charm. There were dozens of photos, each paper choosing different moments to feature. Charlotte squealed with delight when she saw herself on the front page of one paper, waving with both hands. Social media had exploded overnight with photos, videos, and commentary about the coronation. William scrolled through some of it on his phone, sharing particularly sweet or funny posts with Catherine. People from around the world had stayed up or woken early to watch, sharing their own connections to the British monarchy, or simply expressing admiration for the ceremony's grandeur. There was a funny video that had gone viral of Louis yawning during the ceremony, his little mouth opening wide enough to swallow the world. Rather than being embarrassed, Catherine laughed, recognizing that such moments made their family relatable. Perfect, polished royals were impressive but distant. A 5-year-old yawning during a long ceremony was something every parent could understand. As they sat together, Charlotte asked what happened now. Was Grandpa going to come live with them? Were they going to have another big party tomorrow? Catherine explained gently that life would return mostly to normal, that they would go back to their own home and their regular routines. The coronation was a special once-in-a-lifetime event, not something that happened regularly. George seemed relieved by this news. As much as he had been honored to participate, the intensity of public attention was exhausting. He missed his normal life, his school friends, the ability to just be a kid without cameras following his every move. William understood this feeling deeply, remembering his own childhood struggles with the loss of privacy that came with royal status. They spent the rest of the morning relaxing, with no official duties scheduled. It was a rare gift of unstructured time, and they took full advantage. Louis played with his toy cars on the floor, creating elaborate stories of racing and adventure. Charlotte drew pictures of the coronation, her artistic interpretation featuring a crown that was bigger than the person wearing it, and flowers that were every color of the rainbow. George read a book, something about space exploration that had captured his interest. He occasionally looked up to share interesting facts with whoever was listening. William engaged with him, asking questions and encouraging his curiosity. Education was important, but so was passion for learning, and George showed both in abundance. Around midday, Charles and Camilla invited them for lunch in the palace's private dining room. It was a small, intimate gathering, just immediate family, a stark contrast to the massive public celebrations of the day before. The meal was relaxed, with conversation flowing naturally between topics. They discussed the coronation, sharing favorite moments and behind-the-scenes stories that the public would never know. Charles looked different today, more like himself and less like a symbol. He joked with his grandchildren, listened to their observations about the ceremony, and thanked them again for being such a wonderful support. Camilla was warm and friendly, going out of her way to make sure the children felt comfortable and valued. She had grown into her role beautifully, and Catherine appreciated the effort she made with the grandchildren. After lunch, the Cambridge family prepared to leave, heading back to their primary residence. They needed to return to something approaching normal life, at least for a few days. The children had school, William and Catherine had engagements scheduled, and they all needed rest and recovery from the intensity of the coronation. As they said goodbye, Charles hugged each of his grandchildren tightly. He whispered something to George that made the boy stand a little straighter, a private word between the king and his heir. With Charlotte, he was playful, making her giggle. He scooped Louis up and tossed him gently in the air, catching the squealing boy and kissing his cheek. The ride home was quiet, all three children tired despite the late morning start. They watched the London streets pass by, still decorated from the celebrations but returning to their normal rhythm. Shop owners were taking down temporary decorations, street cleaners were dealing with the aftermath of massive crowds, and life was resuming its regular pattern. When they arrived home, it felt like a relief. This was their space, more modest than the palace, but truly theirs. The children scattered to their rooms, happy to be back in familiar surroundings. Louis immediately pulled out different toys. Charlotte found her art supplies, and George settled in a comfortable chair with his space book. Catherine and William looked at each other and smiled. They had navigated one of the most significant royal events in decades, and their family had emerged stronger. The children had shown the world who they were, not just as royal figures, but as real, relatable kids. And they had done it together, supporting each other through every moment. That evening, as they tucked the children into their own beds in their own home, there was a sense of completion. The coronation was behind them, a beautiful memory captured in countless photos and videos. But more importantly, it had been a moment of family unity, a demonstration that beneath the crowns and ceremony, they were simply people who loved each other. George asked one last question before sleep claimed him. He wanted to know if, when it was his turn to be king, William and Catherine would be there to support him the way they had supported Grandpa Charles. William's eyes grew misty as he assured his son that they would always be there for him, through every challenge and triumph. That was what family meant. Charlotte's last words were simpler. She announced that she wanted to be a princess forever because it meant wearing pretty dresses and waving at nice people. Catherine kissed her forehead and told her she would always be a princess. But being a good person was more important than any title. Louis was already asleep, having crashed the moment his head hit the pillow. Catherine adjusted his blanket and stroked his hair, marveling at how such a small person could be so full of life and energy. Tomorrow he would wake up and probably forget half of what had happened, but the photos would always remind him of the day he had been part of history. As William and Catherine finally settled into their own bed that night, they reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from university students who met by chance, to a couple navigating the complexities of royal life, to parents raising 3 children in the most unusual circumstances imaginable. The coronation had been a culmination of sorts, a marking of transition not just for Charles but for their entire family. The future stretched before them, uncertain in its details, but clear in its direction. George would eventually become king,